According to eyewitnesses, Santiago began shooting, emptied his gun. There was a pause in the shooting as people lay there, either dead or wounded or trying to look inconspicuous. He reloaded and again started shooting. Then, perhaps at the approach of law enforcement, lay down on the ground, spread-eagled, and allowed himself to be taken into custody. And other things that we have been told about the case, according to the brother of Santiago, Brian Santiago, tells the Associated Press his family got a call in recent months from Esteban's girlfriend alerting them to the situation, that he apparently had been receiving psychological treatment. At one point, he is said to have entered the FBI agent's FBI office in Anchorage, Alaska, and told officers there that he had been ordered by U.S. intelligence to listen to ISIS videos. A strange situation. If we were to, he did serve in the military, served in Iraq, received a general discharge, that is to say, less than honorable discharge. And we'll talk about the circumstance tonight with Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He is Executive Director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. Dr. Del Carmen, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
The circumstances here, at least on the surface, sound like someone who had serious mental trouble. Again, we can only review the information that we have at this juncture, but I guess that's certainly what it sounds like.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, from what we've learned from the media and from others that are there on the scene, this individual was someone that, obviously displayed signs of anxiety, depression, and various other things, and unfortunately, he decided to take matters into his own hands today and kill, as you noted, several people and injure others.
Yeah. And, of course, the first thing that we think of in circumstances like this is how come he was not detected and treated earlier? And there's a second thing that I'll also bring up in a moment here, but let's look at that first one. Every time this sort of thing comes up, we inevitably go to question number one, and we are told that mental health in this country is terribly underfunded. Anything you care to add to that?
Well, I mean, not only that, but also, in the context of law enforcement, what can they do? You have somebody that shows up at their doorstep and says, look, the CIA or whomever is, pushing me to, go through ISIS and do this and the other. And the reality is they may have at that point looked at each other, the FBI, and said that this guy is not all there, but at the same time, given our constitutional constraints, given our constitutional rights, they're in an incredibly weak position to be able to refer this young man to a clinical, source, or perhaps even to order him through the court system to undergo clinical treatment. So their perspective is they're going to file the case, and they're going to put all the notes down and put him away and let him go. And so from their standpoint is very sad. I know that the media has been saying often this afternoon and evening that he did go to the FBI office and he did speak to FBI agents in Alaska, but the reality is those FBI agents are in an incredibly weak position to do anything about it. And so the larger point is, what can everybody else do, right?
Yeah.
And that's where family and friends come in.
Exactly. And, of course, then you look at a situation like this and having the system having run its course with someone like this, somehow with 5 dead, oh, well, doesn't seem like quite an adequate answer, does it?
Right. And then on top of it, go ahead.
I was going to say, we did the best we could, oh, well.
Right, and then so at the end of the day, it's like, who's going to take responsibility for this? I mean, obviously we have a shooter that was not crazy enough to take on law enforcement, and that's kind of an interesting aspect of the story. Here's this guy that basically lands and retrieves his luggage and then loads up his weapon, goes out and starts killing people, and then he reloads and then continues to kill. But yet when he sees people with armed, and training, that are about to confront him, he lays down his weapon on the ground. And so it's kind of interesting that the madness that he's undergoing does not continue to fight individuals that would equate to the firepower that he's got. And so I found that to be an interesting aspect of the story.
And then, of course, when you face a circumstance like this, there will inevitably come up the following suggestion, which, of course, can sound chilling, even Orwellian, but that is, if we know somebody's got a problem, people would still be alive today if some kind of preventive action had been taken, some kind of, I don't know, preventive detention. This is where the argument usually gets rather fuzzy. Preventive doing what? You know, somebody shows signs of mental illness, what? We lock him up? What? We don't let him fly airplanes? We confiscate his guns? I mean, doing something beforehand is an understandable impulse, and yet inevitably I find that nobody's able to quite pin down precisely what it is that we should be doing.
Right, and so here you have, you know, and I think your question is spot on. I mean, you've got an individual where you had missed opportunities, things that we could have done to prevent this, perhaps not, because when there's a will, there's a way. Maybe we would have treated him for a while, and then he would have done this somewhere else. But at the end of the day, the bigger question is, if in the context of the big picture, although this is a tragedy, there's no question, and there are people tonight whose lives have changed, forever. And you've got not only those that have lost loved ones tonight, but also those that witnessed it, that will never, ever be the same again. Never. I mean, these folks will carry this trauma for the rest of their lives. And things will happen in their lives as a result of what happened, what they witnessed today. But having said all that, you know, do you change, you know, drastically all the policies and regulations about loading weapons into luggage that is checked in for this one instance, in the hopes that this doesn't happen again ever? Or do you simply look for those quote-unquote early signs of mental illness and make sure that folks that are undergoing clinical help do not have access to weapons? And so the question will always be, where do we draw the line?
Indeed. We'll come back and we'll ask a few more and get a few more answers as well as we talk with Dr. Alex Del Carmen. He is the Executive Director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas, as we examine yet another shooting, this time apparently, based on what we know at this juncture, we're not talking about any kind of terrorism. We're talking about some kind of mental illness. But for 5 people, of course, they're just as dead either way. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. Back in a moment. Welcome back to the Jimbo Hannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. As gunshots erupted at the Fort Lauderdale, Florida airport this afternoon, leaving 5 people dead, 8 injured. The gunman appeared to be acting alone. He is in custody and being questioned. And we sit and we shake our heads and we wonder what could possibly be done. Dr. Alex Del Carmen is with us this evening. He is the Executive Director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas. And in looking at the case here, the warning signs, again, we note that there were warning signs galore, no question about that, in various examples of his general discharge from the Alaska Army National Guard in August of last year for unsatisfactory performance. There were clearly a lot of warning signs. His brother quoted his girlfriend as saying he was undergoing psychological treatment. On the surface of it, I mean, these are things that probably millions of people in one form or another undergo. Some people aren't meant for military service, and goodness knows the number of people who undergo psychological counseling in this country. I'd hate to think how many millions of people that is. It's just difficult. Even the statement that the government was ordering him to watch ISIS videos, in and of itself, is there any trigger there that you see, Doctor, that could possibly have been used beforehand for some kind of intervention?
Yeah, I mean, clearly this young man was displaying signs that perhaps he's suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Perhaps he's got some delusional components to the traumas that he likely experienced when he was overseas fighting for our country. So here is a case of someone who comes back after notable service overseas and begins to experience these delusional thoughts and ideas. And so clearly this continued to degenerate, and the absence of medical help and the fact that people around them sort of knew something was wrong, but perhaps never did anything about it. I'm sure there are a lot of folks tonight that are looking at each other saying, we should have said something, we could have done this, we could have done that. But the reality is that in this country, this is not an exception. There are thousands of people that display these signs on a daily basis, and people that may be listening to your show now that know of loved ones that are doing this, that they either don't have the resources to be able to attend to them, and quite frankly, sometimes they don't have the courage to be able to face someone and say, you do need help, and you need to go seek that help. And fortunately for the rest of us, most of those cases do not end up in an act of violence. But from time to time, you do have these individuals that, as it was the case for this young man, that was trained by our own military to take lives. And if you look at the way he killed people, he shot him in the head, which is what you're trained to do in the service, center mass and also in the head. And so clearly he was following his military training, but undergoing a psychological trauma.
Yeah. Now, from the standpoint of most people out there, and they're thinking about their friend Fred. Okay, Fred's a little weird. Fred's gotten weirder. Fred scared me the other day, and they're all wondering now because they like Fred. They know Fred. They've partied with Fred. They went to school with Fred. But now they look at this story, and then they look at our fictitious Fred here, and they wonder, do I jump up? Do I raise my hand? Do I start an intervention process that we're not talking about having him arrested, but are we going to start an intervention that could wind up maybe marking him for the rest of his life? Because there is still a stigma in this society attached to, shall we say, mandatory psychological evaluation. And people, they stop. They wonder about that because, of course, for these people, this is just a gunman, except for the people who knew him. It's just another name, somebody who killed a bunch of people. But my fictitious Fred, and a lot of us have a fictitious Fred out there. Fictitious Fred is our buddy, and we're shy about taking a step, even if it's necessary, that might mar the rest of his life. That's a difficult thing for people to do, Doctor.
Sure, and then on top of that, most people are not trained as clinicians. Most people out there don't really understand the depth and the complexity of mental illness. And so when, we use lay terms like, oh, this person is not well, or this person is crazy, or this person is the other. But in reality, most people are not trained as psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists to be able to assess someone's behavior as being outside the norm. And so by virtue of that, you've got to, but we do have the common sense, perhaps, and that's perhaps a better way of saying it, that we know what's likely going to be acceptable behavior and what is not. Some of the reports that came in tonight about this young man was that he was actually on the flight from Alaska to Fort Lauderdale, and there were some issues along the way on the flight. So in other words, there were so he was not well. This guy got on that plane, and he was already experiencing those perhaps delusional components he was trying to let other people know, I'm about to explode, I'm about to explode, I'm about to explode. And then sure enough, he shows up and retrieves his luggage, and off he goes. And so the question is, what can we do as a society in order to prevent that from happening again?
Well, it would seem that there are things we can do to minimize it, but there's nothing you can do to prevent it. Not in a free society. I mean, you can't just take somebody who exhibits such symptoms and throw them in a gulag someplace, which is what I guess the old Soviet Union would have done. We don't do that kind of thing, and so
exactly,
I can see minimizing it maybe a little bit, but essentially, a free society composed of fragile human beings almost has to let a lot of these people slip through the cracks, because the alternative is a draconian system that none of us would be happy in. We'd all be mental cases.
That's right. And if you look at societies in general through history, the ones that don't experience much violence are the ones that have an absolute controlling government. In other words, a government that tells you what to do, where to do it, and how to do it. And so the question has always been, between due process and crime control. And we teach this, we criminologists teach about this in the classroom, where we try to tell our students that in every society, in every generation, there's a pendulum. And that pendulum always shifts between, do we want to focus on due process as a society, or do we want to focus on crime control? And sometimes the pendulum will shift almost overnight. If you look at 9/11, that's exactly what we did as a country overnight, because this was a traumatic event that hit the nerve of all of the people that experienced it and lived through it. And so the question that you're asking is spot on. When we look at these cases, we often say to ourselves, what can we do to perhaps minimize it, to reduce it, to educate our society on mental illness, to be able to get our government, those that are, go through the armed forces and serve our nation, that once they leave, that somebody follows up with them to make sure that the PTSD that they may experience is treated. We oftentimes abandon our vets and we look the other way, and this has become a huge problem for our country in the past 50 to 60 years.
Amen to that. Stay on the line. We'll speak off air. We'll speak again in just a moment as the break approaches. Dr. Alex Del Carmen, professor at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. What do we do? And how well is the law equipped to deal with this? We'll talk about that aspect of this case of the Fort Lauderdale shooting on the Jim Bohannon Show in just a moment. Glad you're with us on the Jim Bohannon Show tonight as we talk with criminologist Dr. Alex Del Carmen from Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, and with Dennis in Huntsville, Alabama. Good evening, Dennis.
Yes, hello, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we're going, this guy, we're talking mental health a lot. You're getting like that. Well, let me tell you something right here. That's used too easily because, the CIA does use mind control techniques. They're very simple. They've been doing it since the 60s, all right?
In what way? And would they be telling people to watch ISIS videos, really?
Well, it depends upon who the person is on that.
What do you mean by mind control techniques, Dennis? I have to decide whether there's any legitimacy to this call. What do you mean by mind control techniques?
Well, they've got these weapons, these things out here. They can shoot beams right at your head.
I see. Well, Dennis, I would suggest that you seek professional help, okay? Thank you very much for your call. And that was, by the way, my way of saying we move on, and you can hang up the call. Thank you. All right, Dr. Del Carmen, assuming that, in fact, the CIA is not sending energy beams at people's heads here, tell us your thoughts about how well the law is actually grappling with the issue of mental health.
I think we've made an incredible progress in the past 20 years when it comes to law enforcement specifically, having an understanding that there are individuals out there with mental health issues that come across the law enforcement profession and they have to be treated differently. But I can tell you 20 years ago, when I began training police officers across the United States, I remember hearing and reading and talking to officers that had reacted to someone that was having an epileptic attack, for instance, as if the individual was acting out and trying to use force against someone that was clearly mentally ill. And so I think that we have really made huge strides since then, but I would consider that we are still lagging behind as to where we need to be in trying. And I'm not telling you that every police officer needs to be a psychiatrist, but we clearly have to be able to train police officers and federal agents alike to recognize those instances where individuals can then and have a system by which this FBI agent, for instance, could have easily used and referred this individual to some psychiatric help.
Mm-hmm. And you think we're making progress there?
We're definitely making progress, but we're not where we need to be. And sadly, mental illness, has become so much more pervasive than before. And perhaps some people argue it's because now we know what to call it, as opposed to in the old days where we just simply would allow people to do what they wanted to do, and then we would keep it as a quote-unquote family secret. Whereas nowadays we do have this DSM, 4R that simply specifies the psychiatric condition that people experience and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we have to improve the system because we are going to see more and more of this as we go forward, unfortunately.
One seems to be the case, again, for whatever reason, the stresses that society places on people, particularly the military, seem to produce outcomes that are often unpredictable and disastrous. Now, what about the law itself, the wording of the law, the statutes on the books? In your view, do they adequately address issues like this?
Well, they're all over the place. I mean, if you look at every single state, every state varies in terms of what, how progressive they are or not towards mental illness. And then you have the federal law, which typically lags sometimes behind what states are doing. So it depends on which state you're talking about. You have states like Massachusetts that have actually made significant progress, and then you have others that are simply not doing it enough because they're just not having that conversation, or quite frankly, sometimes they don't have the resources to be able to handle it as well. You look at mental illness among the homeless population. Look at mental illness among those that leave the military. The VA hospital would argue that, yeah, we take care of our vets and we provide psychiatric help, but the reality is sometimes, people that are undergoing mental illness is so severe that they themselves don't think that they need it.
And, of course, you mentioned something else, too, the homeless. There was at one time a school of thought in this country, which I have derided over and over on this program, the notion that I think it started back in the 70s, and it was, it's time to liberate the mentally ill in this country, liberate them from staying in institutions, liberate them to live out on the streets and freeze to death and be vandalized and beaten up by others, liberate them to sleep in their own filth and body waste. I don't know who the brain-dead idiot was who thought that was such a bright idea, but we have turned loose not only on society but on each other, people who are manifestly unfit to govern their own lives. And they have liberated nothing, in my view.
Right, and then not only that, but not only are they not equipped to handle their own lives, but they harm the lives of other people. And so, it's sort of that old belief that, look, if you're going to go out there and do something to yourself, that's your own business. But when you're out there jeopardizing the lives of thousands of people potentially, and then on top of that, you have to remember, and this is really, really, I think, a really, really important aspect of the story, that we live in incredibly dangerous times. Just a few minutes ago when the FBI was giving out their press conference out of the Fort Lauderdale airport, it was specified that the FBI is not ruling out terrorism. And so it doesn't mean that this guy was aligned with ISIS, but it is saying that they're not ruling it out at this time. And what that means is that even someone who is mentally ill that can get on a computer, identify ISIS websites, and then go out there and proclaim that they are followers of ISIS, if ISIS could in turn, have not only one, but thousands of terrorists across the globe from individuals that are mentally ill that would simply feel that the government is after them or that they themselves are soldiers of ISIS. And so it's really terrifying because we live in times that, unlike any other time in our history where information is fast, is quick, where anyone with a laptop and a Wi-Fi can connect anywhere across the globe. And so folks that don't receive help have access to really harming other people in a way that we've never had access to before.
Let's talk to Doc in Wilmington, Delaware. Hello, Doc.
Hello, Mr. Bohannon. 2 quick points, quick points, one from personal experience and one from my readings. There was a book written in the 1970s called The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which was about CIA Project Ultra, MK Ultra, about how the CIA tried to find a Manchurian candidate type of a candidate for assassinations abroad. The project was a total and utter failure because they found that you could not literally control a human being's mind. That's factual. Second point, as a person who's battled various diseases his whole life, among them depression, I'm now in remission and recovery, thank God, thanks to a very good therapist and a good psychiatrist and some good medications. I can tell you from people that I've met at the place where I go to get my medications and my therapy that it's almost impossible to predict violent behavior unless a person is in your office and manifests violent behavior or says, I'm going to do such, and I have access to weapons, or a person manifests violent behavior or violent acts.
Right. All right. Any thoughts, Dr. Del Carmen?
Yeah, I mean, I think your caller brings up excellent points, but one of them is that, I've been studying violent behavior for 20 years as an academic, and 10 years, if you include my grad school years, a total of 30. And I can tell you that anyone in the world is potentially a violent person if given the right motive and the right conditions in which to display that. So at the end of the day, your caller is right in that we really don't have a magic wand that allows us to predict who's going to be violent or not. But what we do know is that there are predictors, or if you want to call it indicators, that individuals oftentimes show that can lead someone to be violent or potentially be violent. And when you add mental illness, when you add to that the idea of having access to a gun and the information system in which we live, it becomes a nuclear warhead. And that's the point that I want your listeners to really think about, which is that we live in very, very different times.
We're going to take a quick break, be back with more calls, and also we'll hear from tonight's FBI news conference in Fort Lauderdale in just a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show as we talk about the shootings at the Fort Lauderdale, Florida airport. And this is part of what was said during an FBI news conference in Fort Lauderdale this past evening.
Again, as I mentioned, with these types of incidents, as horrific they are, we are looking at all avenues. We have not ruled out terrorism, and we will be pursuing every angle to try to determine the motive behind this attack, and any associates, any connections, communication, everything that you can imagine. I assure you we are pursuing every possible lead. The individual did walk into our Anchorage office in November. He came in and spoke with FBI agents. At that time, he clearly stated that he did not intend to harm anyone. However, his erratic behavior concerned FBI agents that were interviewing him, and they contacted local police and turned him over to the local police. He was taken into custody by the local police and transported to a medical facility for a mental health evaluation. We looked at his contacts, we did our interagency checks and everything, and at that point we closed our assessment.
And that is George Pirro, the FBI special agent in charge from the Miami office, speaking at the news conference in Fort Lauderdale. Jim is in Kansas City to join us tonight. Hello, Jim.
Hi, Jimbo. Thanks for taking the call again.
Sure.
Oh, I just thought it was interesting that you mentioned Orwellian society, because in Orwellian society, what would happen is, no matter what the real cause of something was, the government would rename it in order to justify reauthorization of whatever legislation they wanted to justify. In other words, if it was terrorism and they didn't want to admit that it was terrorism, they'd just say the guy was mentally ill so that they'd have an excuse to reauthorize the mental illness part of Obamacare.
Well, that gets a little Machiavellian here. I don't know that we can ascribe purely political motives necessarily to all of this. We're simply looking at what, in fact, is possible carried to an extreme here. In this particular case, I don't think that we're talking about something quite that far down the road. Do you think, Professor Del Carmen?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think right now what we're looking at is this one individual and what exactly led that person to commit this violent crime. We can argue that policies that are made by our government affect people, and ultimately people, end up doing things like what this guy did today that are horrible, right? So we can always make that jump. But at the end of the day, it's about what led this one person to simply engage these innocent bystanders and kill them.
To Christopher in Springfield, Missouri. Hello, Christopher.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I can only speak for what goes on here in Missouri, and I can say that I've worked with individuals that are classified as a forensic client since the 1980s. And the vast majority of people that I've worked with are high-risk, violent people that live in the community.
May I ask just a matter of a preface here, how you work with them? Are you a counselor, a police officer?
It's in mental health.
Okay.
I'm not a police officer.
Okay, in mental health. Go ahead.
Right. And I'm also appointed by the court to be a guardian over a forensic client, so I have a forensic guardianship. And what we're finding here in Missouri is kind of an explosion of forensic guardianships, predominantly by the individuals, we call them public administrators. And those are individuals who are actually elected by the people, and one of their duties is to be a guardian. And we're finding more and more individuals with mental illness that have a criminal history that are actually in need of guardians. The problem that we're finding is that the laws are not keeping up with this, and legislators are very hard-headed to create the kind of laws that we need. But on the other side, we also find that with law enforcement, it's very difficult as well. As a guardian, I have the legal authority to civilly commit the person that I'm a guardian over for up to 30 days, and then I would need a court order.
Are you immune to being sued by such people? I would think the system wouldn't work unless you had some kind of immunity.
Well, no, actually, we don't have any immunity at all.
Wow, that's kind of a tricky path to follow, isn't it? I mean, every time you do your job, you may wind up in court.
Exactly, but if I needed to civilly commit the individual that I'm a guardian of, and I called law enforcement, I can tell you I'm going to have to battle them, because what they're trained is to go off of what the individual is saying. If they're not saying they're suicidal or they want to harm somebody else, then they're not going to assist. But as the guardian, my word is gold, and if I say civilly commit him, he's civilly committed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But getting that cooperation from law enforcement is very difficult. But even from doctors, it's difficult as well, because there's not enough studies done about forensic guardianships. And even without a forensic guardianship, I mean, there are a lot of individuals out there that fall through the cracks, because the mental health system has not come into the 21st century.
All right, now we're going to have to take a break here, and I'd like you to stay on the line. I want to have time for Dr. Del Carmen to respond as well, and we'll be back on the Jim Bohannon Show in a moment. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show with our guest, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, professor at Tarleton State University in their Criminology department, and we're on the line with Christopher in Springfield, Missouri, a gentleman who seems to have a great deal of discretion in dealing with such cases. Your thoughts, Dr. Del Carmen?
Well, I mean, I think your caller, was spot on. Once again, I mean, you're looking at law enforcement, responding to a call, and sometimes perhaps most of the officers may not even deal with these cases often. So, as a result of that, when they probably show up at the front door, they have to call their sergeant, they have to alert someone as to what's going on, so they can get some clarification as to where the law stands. What's really sad about where we are in our criminal justice system is that many, many agencies within that system operate under the basis that they are so afraid of being sued that they would rather not take a chance or go outside of what's normative for them on a daily basis. And so we live in that type of a society and an environment where being proactive, I'm not necessarily saying that we have to intervene and incarcerate and quote-unquote use this preventive excuse to be able to put people in prison. I don't believe in that. But at the same time, I think it is important for those individuals that need to have intervention to receive it and to receive treatment. And sadly, our governmental entities, the law is always behind our reality. I mean, this has been historical for our nation, 20, 30 years behind.
Christopher, if you're still there, I'm curious, given that you grapple with the system daily, if you had the power to change the law, how would you change it?
There's so many things wrong about the laws that it's a difficult question to answer. I think our system is really built on a reactive way of handling things instead of a proactive way. In other words, if I call law enforcement and I say he's in a psychotic state, I need him, taken to the ER and whatever, I'm going to have a lot of problems with law enforcement. But if he goes out and commits a crime, well, then they're all there to help. But unfortunately, it's to help as in put him in jail. And I would like to avoid that, but I can't get that level of cooperation. And trying to get the laws passed that we need is extremely hard because there is such a brick wall in bringing the mental health system into the 21st century that it almost seems like it's just not going to happen.
Christopher, thank you for your call. About a minute left, Dr. Del Carmen. How would you change the system if you had the power to do so?
Well, it begins with the education of the public, because at the end of the day, legislators are not going to follow outside of what people really want. They're scared to death of being voted out of office, and for some of them, it becomes a career. And so I think the public needs to be informed as to those realities that your caller was just pointing out to, and the thousands of people that are being affected by the carelessness, by the lack of response, and sometimes by the late response that our governmental entities have to help people out. So I would say education. I would also say being proactive and getting the community involved. And thirdly, for us to understand that this is a real serious problem for most of us in the United States. Either if you don't know someone that has mental illness or don't have a family member that has mental illness, you will be affected by someone that has mental illness at some point in your life.
We will pause on that note and talk with you off air. Again, Dr. Alex Del Carmen is Executive Director of the School of Criminology, Criminal Justice, and Strategic Studies at Tarleton State University in Fort Worth, Texas, and we're examining what we can do about cases such as the Fort Lauderdale Airport shooting. I'm Jim Bohannon on Westwood One.